Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I'm happy to be back with you. We are packing up our house, getting ready to move. You can see here, this is a blanket with a picture of my grandmother on it. And that's in my keep box. It's separating things into throwaway, giveaway, keep, and just plugging away at it. Today's topic can be quite heavy, so take care of yourself if you don't want to listen. It is about internal family systems and suicidality. I will say though that in IFS, there's a lot more hope. There's a lot less fear. You'll see that there are no bad parts, and that in actually going toward parts that we fear, asking parts that are afraid if they'll give space, and going toward parts that we fear with curiosity and openness, we gain insight, we gain understanding for their good intention, even suicidal parts, which tend to be the kingpin of kind of this hierarchy of firefighters, right? So firefighters are parts that help us essentially escape and numb once the pain of our exiles comes to the surface. Our managers try to prevent the exiles from coming up. They shame them or press them down or try to be perfect and manage everything in our inside and outside so that the exile's pain doesn't come up. But they are often not successful. And so when the pain of our exiles gets activated, whether it's from another person, something they said or did or didn't say or didn't do, or something in our environment, once that does come up, the firefighter's job is to put the flames out now, right? That's why they're a firefighter, because the fire is there, but they're pointing you to the fire. So they're actually really helpful. The firefighters are like the fire alarm, not the fire. The exiles are the fire, but the fire alarm of the firefighter is pointing you to the exile so that you, the one who is calm and compassionate and confident and courageous inside, can go to them and help them, because that core self in you is capable of helping and reparenting and healing them. So when you get the urge to binge, right? Whether it's food or alcohol or Netflix or whatever it is, right? You have this compulsion. I have to eat this bag of chips, this bowl of ice cream, or I have to get some alcohol or some kind of medication or whatever it is. I have to numb this pain, right? It feels unbearable. It's actually pointing you toward the very thing that needs your help. It means the exile is on the surface right now. And so it's the most valuable time and opportunity to say, hey, usually initially it's just a tiny bit of time, but can you let me go to that pain? And you can negotiate. Can I go for 2 minutes? No, 20 seconds or 10 seconds, right? And to just say, I'm with you, I see your pain. It really isn't about learning how to be with our pain, to let it come up, to love it, to be with it, to not suppress it, that our firefighters learn that we can handle it, that our adult self can handle it. And then they don't have to do their job anymore. But the kingpin of those firefighters is suicide. It's the ultimate escape from the pain, right? So if the addictions, the dissociation, the other, numbing techniques do not work, that's when often the suicidal part will come in. And we'll see that there are a few different types of suicidal parts. But let me begin by sharing my screen. So again, this was a topic that came up in the monthly IFS practitioner consultation group. And this can be a really tricky thing especially for practitioners, because it's scary, right? I mean, this is literally a life and death situation. And the biggest thing that our systems are afraid of is death and ourselves and other people. So it makes sense that when a client presents with a suicidal part, that it would actually cause a lot of activation and fear and concern in the therapist or coach. So if you are a therapist or coach or someone who's working with another person who has a suicidal part, the first thing is to tend to your own parts and to really validate them and let them know, I see you. This is really scary. It makes sense that you feel overwhelmed, because you can't offer your own self energy to the other person if you're blended with other parts. So the solution is that you need to turn towards your own parts first. That's always the solution. Whenever, as a therapist or coach, we get activated in a session. Okay, let me continue here. So internal family systems is different than many other therapies who use fear and management of suicidal parts. We do not fear suicidal parts, but befriend them and attempt to understand their good intentions. So understandably, in a lot of other therapies, in my experience, they're run by manager parts, right? And these manager parts, like I said, make sense. They're kind of like, you need to sign a thing. They're kind of contracting with the suicidal part. You need to sign a thing that you will not take your life, right? And the thing is that the suicidal part doesn't really abide by contracts. So it doesn't, it's kind of a false sense of security. Like, okay, I feel more secure, but I'm trying to strong arm the part to convince them to do this. It actually is a little bit different type of part, but it reminds me of one of the core stories that Dick Schwartz tells about creating and discovering internal family systems, about the client that he had that had eating disordered parts, but also had a cutting part that would punish her, or actually, it is explained, help her numb and escape by cutting, by causing physical pain so that she didn't have to deal with the more emotional pain of her exiles, right? But initially he did not know that. All he knew was that this part was harming her, was hurting her, was cutting her body. And it was very scary to a lot of his parts. And so initially he tried to fight the part, right? And strong arm the part and say, stop it, you better stop it, right? And this is always going to be another part, right? Whether it's within a person's system or it's the part in another person, right? That's afraid and just understandably, genuinely wants this harmful behavior to stop, right? They make sense completely. It's just that it's not effective. It doesn't work. Because if, let's say you're doing something that you are desperate about, that you think you must do, if another person just tells you to stop, you're not going to stop if you feel like you have to do it, right? Because the root issue has not been taken care of. So you can't just strong arm a part into stopping, whether logically convincing them or anything. You have to deal with the root. You have to take away the reason why they're doing what they're doing, right? So ultimately, this is where Dick, uh, you know, got the cutting part to agree to stop cutting her, but then the next time she came in, she had a gash down her face. It was escalating, right? And a lot of times firefighters do that. The more you try to control them, the bigger they get because they're kind of rebellious, right? They're like, heck no, I'm not going to listen to you. And so finally Dick gave up. He said, I give up, you win. And then that was the first time the part opened up and said, I don't want to win. I don't want to harm her. It's just the alternative is worse. I can't let her feel the pain of the abuse that she suffered from her father, and began explaining why it did this. So all firefighter parts have a reason why they're doing it. And if we're blended with parts that are just trying to get them to go away and stop them and hate them and are frustrated and fear them, they're not going to open up to us. Just like if you have people in front of you who are judging you and telling you you're bad, stop it, right? you're not going to feel like you can be vulnerable and open up to them. The same thing with these parts. So we have to ask, again, validate the parts that feel frustrated, want them to stop. You make sense. I get it. But can you let me go to the part who's doing this harmful thing so that I can really understand the root? I can understand what they're protecting, what's underneath, and help that. And then they can naturally relax, which is what you want, right? And so you kind of can negotiate with the parts blocking the way, because they have to give space to the client so that the client, whether, well, if it's you or if you're a therapist and it's your client, so that the client can feel open and curious. And it really helps in a therapeutic setting if you as a therapist are also genuinely curious and understand that there's a good intention behind this part, because you can lend some of that self energy. And so that's why you have to turn toward your parts first, right? So that you can do that naturally. Okay. I've been saying this. The first step as a practitioner is to meet lovingly with the parts that are activated in you. You may need to tell the person, hey, I'm noticing that I have parts that are activated or feeling overwhelmed. It's not your responsibility. Don't worry about it, but I need to tend to them so that I can be here for you. So I'm just going to go inside, and you might do the same. Just be still, be with, model that. Model turning. Sometimes therapists and coaches feel like it's a weakness or something. Like I can't reveal to my client that I have parts that are activated right now. But I have found that it's actually quite a beautiful modeling of, I notice that I'm feeling really overwhelmed. And you can even describe it. I notice it in my chest, and my throat's constricting, and I feel tears coming up. I notice parts that feel sad about, the thought of the suicidal part in you and the pain you must be experiencing. So as you observe and notice what's alive in you and tend to it in front of the client, you're speaking for the parts. You're not blending with them. You're aware of them. And it's a really beautiful modeling, like I said. And I'll get to this point in a second, but I just want to say, because being self-led does not mean that you don't have parts that come up. It means that you are aware of them and you are listening to them and you are turning toward them. It's an illusion. It's a self-like part that it really usually that thinks that you need to be perfect and you need to be unaffected and, completely in self all the time kind of thing. It's not self or parts. It's self and parts all the time. Okay. So in a lot of traditional therapeutic settings, there can be contracts with the person, with their family, um, about not doing certain behaviors, certain harmful behaviors. You can do that. You can do that with the client's inner family. But again, like I said, they may or may not abide by the contracts. It again, this is one of those things I think that's an illusion. It gives us a sense of security. It's kind of reminds me of when I was in an abusive marriage and people told me to get a restraining order against my first husband. And I remember saying, you don't understand, that will not stop him, right? I mean, I'll be dead before anyone knows that he trespassed the restraining order. Or when I was a teacher, I remember realizing the illusion that I had control over these other kids, right? All these kids that were acting out, screaming, getting up, hitting their friend or something. I thought, oh my goodness, the only way I can control them is just threaten them with punishment or bribe them with reward. But ultimately, that may not motivate them and they can do whatever they want, you know? And just feeling overwhelmed by that. But the only influence that we have, the same thing is true of the parts inside of us. It's not effective to try to control them through managing, through punishment and reward. Instead, the most influence we can have on people outside of us and parts inside of us is to listen to them, to really, really get why they make sense, what their good intention is, why they're doing what they're doing. So the most important thing beyond contracting is to understand the parts that are afraid of the suicidality. I get it. You make sense. This is life and death. I really get you, right? The parts that want to stop the suicidality, man, you make sense. But is it working? What if we could get to know them and get to the root? And then ultimately getting really curious with the suicidal part. What are you so afraid of? What's happening? What pain are you protecting from? Or maybe it's something present in the environment. It's like my present, yours or your client's situation, they're in a current situation that feels unbearable and they need to get out of it. The suicidal part is really pointing to something that needs to be changed physically now, you know? So it could be that, uh, it could be past trauma that needs to be healed, right? That continues to be activated. But, I often say that the firefighters are the alarm, right? And they're pointing you to the fire. So sometimes the fire is hard to put out. It's hard to change. It might be that we or our client are in a soul-sucking job, an abusive relationship, a depressing environment. And we or they, need to get out of that. That their depression, even their suicidality makes sense. They are in suffering. Other times it's just a continued activation of parts that are living in the past. And there's beautiful ways in IFS that we can heal that. So there's hope. Okay, I've already said some of this. We work with the parts who fear or manage the suicidal parts first because they really need to be able to give space. And once they do, whether in you as the coach or therapist or you as the client, the self naturally emerges and the self naturally feels curious. So tending to those, it kind of whatever blocks the way is the way. Tend to those that are blocking the way of the self. As they relax, more of the self can emerge toward the suicidal part. So then we befriend the suicidal part to understand their good intention, their fears, what they protect, etc. We can update them. Often a suicidal part, especially when the exile that keeps coming up that's in pain is 5 years old, 10 years old, 16 years old, whatever, we can ask the suicidal part, who do you see when you look at me or when you look at the client? How old are they? Right? And get a sense for what they're seeing and then update them. Actually, I'm 49 or, however old you are, your client is, and then offer them help. I can help that 16-year-old, that 5-year-old. You might not trust that I can, but are you willing to let me go to them for a little period of time? You can stand by and watch and tell me if you're concerned and all of those things, right? You're allied with them. You're like, I get that you really don't want this pain to come up, that you really don't want them to get activated. I care about them too. I'm with you. All right. So, okay, there's, in many ways, there's two kinds of suicidal parts. I've been talking about the escapist part this whole time, but for me personally, and you can, I don't know how to link the past videos, but you can go through my series on IFS self-therapy, that playlist. And I talk about working with one of my suicidal parts. I have another video too where I talk about some of my suicidal parts. I've had a few of them and they are not the escapist kind. They are what Dick Schwartz, at least at one point, called murderous parts. So this is kind of a different experience. And they might also be a tag team kind of working together. But the murderous part is actually more like a really strong inner critic I believe Jay Early calls it the destroyer. It's a part that says, you despicable, awful thing, you deserve to die, you should just kill yourself, right? So if you're hearing that kind of thing inside, or your client's hearing that, that is a really big inner critic. And so what helped with that for me was being able to turn toward it kind of similarly and say, who are you talking to? Because when it says you deserve to die, I would say, who am I? Who am I that I deserve to die? What am I doing? How old am I? And the first one I got to know was pointing at a 5-year-old part that this murderous part thought was just pathetic and despicable because she was so highly sensitive, had so much emotion, and was shamed and ridiculed by her peers and her teachers and parents and family and everybody for being so sensitive and so emotional. And so this part, whenever that 5-year-old part would come up and be sensitive and be emotional, that was the tactic of this murderous part. You deserve to die for being like that. And ultimately, it didn't want me or the system to die. It wanted that part to die because it believed that that part made me unlovable. And if that part was going to keep coming up, then we were just going to need to die because we can't survive with that part up. Anyway, so I needed to update and appreciate that and say, hey, what if I can go to the 5-year-old and I can help her? Again, you can watch the whole interaction. It is super, super enlightening. There's actually, I think, 2 or 3 videos that I have where I talk about it. Um, and again, this can be a common dynamic that happens where the inner critic is so big, it's murderous essentially, that it causes such shame and pain for that exile. So my critic is saying, you're so pathetic, you deserve to die, you're such a burden. And then my 5-year-old, who's very sensitive, our exiles are often our most sensitive parts, feels so, so bad. It just is like this cycle, right? Of kind of like the one who's feeling the pain and the critic. And the shame and pain intensifies, increases. So now this one's feeling more, is more sensitive, and then this one gets bigger. It says, now you better die because you are getting bigger and it's so terrible. And it just escalates until sometimes for some people, then kind of suicide comes in and says, the pain of this murderous part itself is causing so much pain in my system. I need to escape the inner critic, right? It's not even necessarily a situation, a person outside of us. It's this inner critic that we're trying to escape. So in that case, the one to really get to know is the inner critic, to negotiate with them, to help what they're pointing at and say, hey, thank you for pointing me to this part. Can I help them? So, and again, you don't have to guess what's happening in your system or in your client's system. You always just go inside and ask. And as long as you are open to receive, and if you're not, if you have parts blocking the way, get to know them. But once you can just be completely open to receive answers from parts, they will begin putting all the puzzle pieces together. You can ask, how old do you think the client is? And tell me about them. What do you see when you look at them? What are they doing? What do you want to kill? Right? Or is there anyone else here that's having opinion about it? Right? You just receive, ask from curiosity, receive answers, and the picture will eventually come into focus. And because it's different for every person, the specifics are different. And then finally, I think this is the last one. Oh, no. So let me go to this one. It's really important as a therapist or coach to help the client find safety, uh, whether that is in the inner environment or the outer environment, to meet the suicidal part's concerns. This is why going toward befriending the suicidal part actually leads to helping and healing what needs that. because it will tell you, it will point you either the current environment is so unbearable. I'm in a life-sucking job that I hate, or I'm in a partnership, a relationship that is so toxic, or I'm living in this space that is really unbearable for my body, or, I'm living my parents' dream and not mine, or whatever it is, right? It'll point to something that legitimately needs to be changed or helped. And so then we can work with all the parts that don't want to change that. That's usually the next step, right? There's a lot of, you know, cultural burdens, legacy burdens, parts who feel like if they disappoint their parent, they're going to die, things like that. So we can work with all the parts who oppose the change and gradually help the person, not impulsively, not overnight, like change their environment, but work with the parts that are blocking the change, and then they will naturally make the changes that are life-giving to them. So there's kind of these steps of meeting with the different parts that are involved. But the safety, like I said, can also be in the inner environment. Like when you have a murderous, really big, torturing inner critic, the inner environment is not safe. I mean, I was plagued with inner critics. I had almost 24/7, what I thought was one inner critic, it happened to be about 7 different parts that were in charge of different things, criticizing, berating me inside. And so it was a really unsafe environment on the inside. So it wasn't until I was able to turn loving attention toward those critics that I was able to differentiate them from myself, that is very understanding and open and compassionate. And then my parts can also differentiate that. There is no one my parts trust more now than myself. But before, because they didn't understand the difference between all these big critics and the self, they were like, I don't trust myself at all. It's a really dangerous environment in there, right? But those critics are really, really relaxed now and have other jobs, and the main, leader in the system is the self. So they absolutely trust it. Okay, last note. I won't say too much on this because I have a whole video on my experience with unattached burdens, which you can go back and look at. Oh, I'm not sure what playlist it's in, but you can look up, Christine Dixon or The Ordinary Sacred Unattached Burdens, and you probably will find it. So if you're not familiar with what an unattached burden is, it's essentially, I think it's a misnomer. I think it's actually attached, but it's an energy that's kind of not you. It's not part of you that, and there can be a kind of benevolent, positive energies, and there can also be malevolent, kind of what feels like evil energies. But they're they're very similar to the parts inside of us. In some ways, it's not even helpful to think of them as different, but they are. But they still respond well to being loved. Every part inside of us, a part that's not really a part of us, responds, like wants to be loved. That's what I found. So even these kind of, because you can have an unattached burden that is basically like when you ask it, why do you want this person to die? They're just like, because I hate them, because it would be funny, because I'm messing with them or something. I think it seems like there's really no good intention. It may not be a part of the person or of you. It may be this kind of, again, I don't know exactly what it is, but like to me, it seems kind of almost like a disembodied spirit that is trapped. I don't even know if that's, I don't know if that's true, but it still is this dark energy that wants love. And but a lot of unattached burdens can present as kind of these suicidal or murderous parts, particularly, that kind of tell a person, throw yourself off this bridge or do this, they'll kind of like give them an impulse to do something that will hurt themselves. And that can be so, so, so scary. Not just for the coach or the therapist, obviously for the person, right? Because it feels like they're not in control of themselves. Like there's this impulse. And so, again, it's super important as the coach or therapist that you are not afraid. So I would say if you are afraid of these dark energies, refer to someone else. Because if you can't be in self in regard to it, it's not going to listen to you. But if you can be without fear in regards to it, because whatever you do not fear in the inner world cannot hurt you. If you can show up with the courage of self and you can say, I'm not afraid of you. What part of my client are you attached to? Because usually they actually are attached to a young part that feels like it needs some sense of power, or somehow it came in and did attach to a part. So you can then work with that part to release the attachment. And then that energy must leave the system. And you can say, you're no longer wanted in this system, but hey, you're loved. And I want you to be able to go to love. Like sometimes, again, there's always choice. So they can choose to go wherever they want, but they must leave the system. So again, there is hope. In many ways, it's a pretty straightforward process. And what blocks it is the fear in the person and in the therapist or coach, practitioner. So, the person who works the most with this is Bob Falconer. And again, check out my video if you want to understand a little bit more about my experience with unattached burdens. All right, that was a lot. I know it's a really heavy topic. I want to say, if you're listening to this and you have suicidal parts, murderous parts, or are working with a client who does, the reason why I can talk about this and even unattached burdens with such confidence, clarity, courage, and no fear is because I have experienced it. I've experienced suicidal parts, murderous parts, unattached burdens. And I understand very clearly from experience that there really isn't anything to fear. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a complete torment to be blended with those parts. Man, I understand that too. It feels scary as heck, deep suffering. But if you can know that anything that causes pain and suffering in your system is pointing you to something that needs help. It's the fire alarm, not the fire, right? And the hope that you do have wise and loving adult self inside of you that has the capacity to hold and love all of it and be with it, and not fear it, right? There is hope there. So if you have any comments or questions about this, please feel free to leave them in the comments below.